Excited to join you today and talk about one of my favorite topics, experimentation, and even more importantly, experimentation with regards to culture. That is even more exciting topics in many organizations. So let me quickly introduce myself. So thanks, Amy, for the introduction. Just to add a couple of words here. So for the last 4 years, I've worked at Facebook, more specifically at Workplace, where I led the AI team working on different applications of machine learning and AI for work. Most recently was a product lead supporting 6 teams working on the core experience of the product. And before that, I worked at Intercom, at Yandex, at various startups. And right now, I'm a co-founder and the CEO of Vektor, which is a product for mentorship that helps you find mentors, and it's free to use. So essentially, if you feel stuck in your career or if you want to grow to the next level, give it a try. Let me know what you think. So as a PM working primarily with machine learning products, I actually run a ton of experiments over my career. And in addition to that, I also consulted a lot of people on that topic from multiple tech companies. And at some point of talking to people about experimentation and implementing the experimentation practices in their companies, I actually started to notice some interesting trends. So it seemed like companies where experimentation didn't yield any meaningful results had some things in common. And it actually had nothing to do with the stage of a company or number of its employees. In majority of the cases, it actually was a culture clash. So essentially the experimentation values and culture it was bringing wasn't aligned with what organization was doing and was thinking about its own culture. So what I would like to do in the next 20 minutes is to share with you 5 stories where experimentation went wrong because of some unhealthy trends in the organization. So, and hopefully I will share some advice that could help you fix some of those things if you observe the same in your company. Cool. So the first story that I have is about last year when I was interviewing for a CPO position at a startup. And during one of the conversations, the interviewer shared that experimentation wasn't working for them. And when I asked why, he actually shared that they were only running experiments at the very end of the development process after all other research methods were maxed out, and they were sure that they would get positive results. So it meant that experiments were quite rare and were perceived more as a formality rather than a valuable resource. So to me, it became the first and actually one of many red flags that this company might not be the best to join. And first of all, just very practically, when you're running the A/B test with this kind of clear expectation of success, you'll certainly fall into the trap of a confirmation bias. And you'll be looking for any signals that will allow you to go forward with this experiment. And I actually saw this happening many times where people would just disregard the concept of statistical significance and would ship a feature that is just showing this upward trends. Or they would ship a feature that didn't show an impact on the key metrics, but had some unexpected effect on other random metrics. And given that, especially if you're looking at multiple metrics at the same time, just statistically, some of them would just show some changes and this would happen. And second, most importantly, it felt that the company adopted this kind of fixed mindset and created a culture where people would be afraid to fail. So any innovation, if you think about it, actually requires people to be comfortable with failure. Otherwise, they would just resort to some solutions that they already know, and they would hesitate to come up with something really creative and something new. And this emphasis on importance of success, especially with regards to experimentation, might actually prevent you from doing something really innovative. So if you look at the data, only 1 in 10 experiments actually succeed. And that's what's been confirmed by many companies like Google, Facebook, Booking.com. So all those companies that run experiments in large volumes. And if we compare this to companies which do not accept this kind of rate, for them, 9 experiments out of 10 would be considered a waste. And that would mean that essentially this company would think that experiments are not really successful. They would reduce the volume of experimentation, and it just wouldn't make sense, because in absolute numbers, decreasing the volume of experiments would lead to even less success. So if you compare this to great companies, they actually appreciate these failed attempts, because this actually helps them to learn and discover new things about people's behavior. So I have a really interesting story here. So it's kind of a canonic example. When Amazon was working on a new version of a mobile game, and when they launched a new version of it, this actually didn't result in great success. Essentially, the retention dropped by almost 70%, and revenue fell almost 30%. And what happened is that apparently the team increased the difficulty of the game almost by 10%. So thanks to the experiments that they ran, they were able to quickly identify the issue and fix it. But in addition to that, they actually started to think whether this kind of discovery could actually get them gains in retention in revenue. So to find out, they actually ran the test with 4 new levels of difficulty, and they identified that the easiest variant did the best. So essentially, the initial failure led them to this interesting insight that helped them launch a new version and actually increase the revenue by 20%, and also the time spent on the game by 20% as well. So what could you do if you identify such a situation? So how could you introduce this kind of growth mindset to your company? You need to create an emphasis on learning rather than increasing or decreasing certain numbers. And that would help to take away some pressure off the team and allow them to focus on getting knowledge. So first of all, you should recognize the outcomes independent of whether they are successful or they might be considered as negative or neutral. So essentially, you need to ensure that each one of those experiments and each one of those outcomes are equally appreciated by the organization. The second important part is that you need to have a forum that helps you to discuss all those learnings. And the third, which is the most important part, actually identifies the follow-ups on those experiments. Now, essentially, you don't just leave them as they are, but you can extract this knowledge and you can create some iterations. Cool. So another interesting area where you might find out this kind of cultural clash is the short-term versus long-term thinking. So I actually had the situation at the start of my career when I was working at a startup, and I had a very heated argument with the CEO who didn't see the value of introducing experimentation. So the argument was that why spend so much effort on implementing experimentation practices if you could just build a couple of more features from your backlog and measure the results through quality feedback. And that's true, right? Experimentation actually requires quite significant initial investment, because you need to have the infrastructure, you need to introduce the tools, you need to train the team, you have to get more people on board. And obviously, if you're comparing this to just building a feature from your list, it might seem like an expensive investment. But what is quite important here is that this kind of thinking is usually happening in companies which haven't adopted this kind of strategic thinking, and where the product teams are actually working as feature factories and just burning through their backlog. So what is quite important in terms of the thinking is that experimentation should be considered as a long-term investment, and this will help accelerate the cycle of learning and development. So essentially, when you are thinking about experimentation, this should be focused on the overall improvement to your product development cycle rather than an immediate short-term result. And that is quite important, especially for your overall innovation culture, as it doesn't necessarily lead to the results immediately. So it might be something that will happen over time. And as I will show in the future examples, you will see that some things actually will require time rather than leading to an increase immediately. So what could you do to fix it? So I will share what I did in my startup. So we actually identified a very small area where we could significantly speed up the development if we could run an experiment on it. So we were able to demonstrate that the cost of implementation in this specific area versus the impact was quite in a nice ratio. And essentially, it would save us a lot of hours of time in the future by reducing the effort to do the qualitative testing. So essentially, identifying a small area and then connecting it to a long-term picture actually helped us to introduce the experimentation at a startup. Cool. So the next part is what's happening a lot in companies that already have experimentation. I think everybody remembers that the test that Google did with 41 Shades of Blue. Essentially, it was testing literally 41 Shades of Blue for advertising links. And for them, at their size, it actually made sense and led to extra $200 million in revenue. But for companies which are not the size of Google, it probably doesn't make sense to run multivariate testing on very small parts of the system. And it usually is a very clear sign of process-driven cultures. So in this kind of cultures, the thinking is that we should run the experiment no matter what. So essentially, we have some process that we need to follow, and the experimentation is actually a part of it. And it doesn't matter what is actually the context. And don't get me wrong, the process is usually very important. So it helps the org to build the right kind of muscle, especially if experimentation is kind of new to them. But if you don't understand why you're running the experiment, it might not give you the expected result. So first of all, again, just statistically speaking, the more you're measuring, the more likely you're going to see some random fluctuations. So essentially, if you're testing 1 million different variants, then you'll be seeing some change in at least some of them. And that might not necessarily mean that you're making an improvement. It might be just the power of random. It also might lead to some wrong outcomes, because if you don't understand why you're testing it, you might not understand when is the right time to run it, or what is the right audience to roll it out to. So essentially, if you are not clear on what is the target audience and what is the right go-to-market plan in this case, then the results that you will see in the experiment might be actually affected by some circumstances that you might not be aware of. So for example, a lot of experiments that are run in December actually will be different from the experiments that you'll run in February, just because of the seasonal effects, people preparing for holidays and behaving quite differently from the usual kind of experience. In addition to that, there are also some ethical components to that. So companies that test new ideas usually face greater customer scrutiny than competitors that implement new practices without conducting any experiments. And essentially, if you are testing something that is not quite useful to you, and you're just doing it just for sake of experimentation, that might not be perceived as well by your customers. So a lot of companies are thinking about this component right now and making sure that all experiments are run purposefully and with the right approach. So, for example, at LinkedIn, they introduced these guidelines that do not allow you to run experiments that would intentfully deliver a negative experience or have a goal of altering members' moods or emotions. So that's quite an important component that is important to remember. And essentially, if you are just doing experiments, it's quite easy to forget how you can affect the actual people and their experience. So another interesting fact here, like I really like the study by Paul Slovich, that is showing quite clearly that more information does not necessarily mean that you're doing better decisions. So in this experiment, they had a group of professional horse race handicappers, and they were asked to make a prediction about the race. And at first, they were only allowed to pick 5 pieces of information. And with that, they were able to predict the outcome nearly 17% of the time. And their confidence was at 19% level. But then they were allowed to increase the number of information that they selected, and it grew to 40 pieces. And the confidence increased almost twice, but the actual results stayed roughly the same. So it meant that additional data didn't make their predictions better, but actually made them more confident that they are making better decisions. So again, kind of going back to volume of experimentation versus purposeful high quality experimentation, you need to make sure that you're running and you're using this data correctly. More data doesn't necessarily mean better outcomes if you don't understand why you need it. So how you should fix it if you actually encounter that your company is over-indexed on the number of data to collect? So first of all, you should always remember the problem you are trying to solve. So always remember why you're doing what you're doing and what kind of experience you're hoping to change for your users. The second part is that keeping the problem in mind, you should always understand what kind of research method works best to get the signal on this problem. And obviously, experimentation is a fantastic method, but it should be compared to other ones as well, because they might be more relevant to this specific situation. And then a very important part is that you should always have a hypothesis for your experiment. So never run an experiment that doesn't have a clear hypothesis, because then you'll just be looking at some random results without understanding what actually happened. Cool. So compared to this last situation that I just shared, there is another almost a reverse approach here. So HIPPO is a highest paid person opinion. And that happens quite often when their opinion actually trumps data. So I had a mentee who worked for a game development company, and they run a lot of experiments, but each one of them actually had to be vetted by senior management and potentially could get overruled. And the team would essentially bring the results to the review, and then the manager would have intuition that something is not right and make a decision that is not based on data. That's unfortunately happening quite often, and it's really a bad situation because it kind of defeats the purpose of experimentation and disempowers people who run experiments. Obviously, we shouldn't blindly follow whatever the data dictates, and there are some situations where experiments are just the input for your strategic decisions. But in the majority of the cases, especially when there is a previous agreement in place and you have a clear hypothesis and it was validated, then the empirical results of experiments actually should prevail, independent whether they clash with strong opinions or not. So what's important here is that you should always have the protocol when you can disregard the results of the experiment. It shouldn't be the option just for HIPPOs. Everyone should be able to understand why this decision is being made, why the results of the experiment are disregarded, and be able to exercise it as well. So 2 areas where I find this working really well is, first of all, is identifying the strategic part of the experiment. Like, is it just one input to the decision, or it's actually the definitive factor to making a decision? And then the second part is having the guardrails. So making sure that when you're thinking about the hypothesis, you are identifying certain factors that shouldn't change no matter what. And this is usually helpful when you are stating like what should happen as a result of the experiment and how then it should be used in the interpretation of the results. Cool. So the last part that I wanted to talk to you is quite often happening as well. We live in a world where we move very fast, and we actually encourage this culture of heroism, where people encouraged to go after new shiny things and not think about improvements to like small things and iterating on existing features. Unfortunately, it happens quite often when we run an experiment, we get some results, and then we just move on to a new project. as we didn't have time to reflect on learnings. And it's quite sad, not just because we could get some useful learnings out of those iterations, but some of those results that you got might actually be false positives, or they might regress over time. So that happened to me as well. So especially in machine learning, there are certain regressions to machine learning models. So when we rerun some old experiments, we actually get different results, because it might be some changes to the product that happened over time, so that the experiment is not working anymore. It might be that the data that was collected for the ML model actually changed, and now the experience that we provide is not optimal anymore. Very few companies actually do retesting for the experiments that they run, and essentially kind of due to this culture of shiny new things, they see the initial small improvement, and then they are afraid that if they run the experiment, it actually would end up with contradictory results and undermine previous findings. And this kind of brings me back to my first point, focusing on learnings rather than on numbers. We want to make sure that we are building something valuable for our users, and we want to make sure that the results that we are getting from the experiment are actually reliable rather than just being an increase. So usually the smaller the improvement, the less reliable the result, and you should always try to ensure that you retest the experiments that you run, especially if it's about the critical part of your product. Doing iterations actually is very helpful because it can multiply the learnings that you received in your previous experiments and make sure that you have this improvement that is accumulated over time. So we talked about a lot of different areas, and we talked about employees' curiosity and their focus on learning. We talked about data trumping opinion, but also experimentation being purposeful and enabling long-term thinking. It is all very difficult. Experimentation is difficult, but changing culture is even more difficult. But if you can do this successfully, you actually will be rewarded with a true culture of innovation, and that is really special. So hope you will all be able to do that in your companies.